Rosa Delgado tucked her hair behind her ear as she cleaned the floor of the main hallway of the building. Nova Sol, one of the most imposing buildings on Paseo de la Reforma, was now past midnight, and the echo of her footsteps was the only thing that broke the silence. Her worn but clean uniform reflected the effort she put into each task. Even when no one noticed, working as a cleaner wasn't what she had dreamed of as a child. Rosa had wanted to be a graphic designer, creating logos and advertising campaigns that people would see all over the city. However, the cost of her studies was prohibitive, and with her mother sick at home, every peso she earned went towards paying for medicines and covering basic expenses. Every night, while the rest of the city slept, Rosa walked through the offices of the powerful, dreaming of a different future. In contrast, Alejandro Gomez, CEO of Nova Sol, was in his office on the 40th floor, reviewing a crucial report. His watch showed 12:30 a.m., but he had no intention of going home. Alejandro was a man accustomed to success and pressure. At 38, he had built one of the most important technology companies in Latin America. With a perfectly tailored suit and a panoramic view of Mexico City at his feet, he embodied everything Rosa saw as unattainable. Despite his success, Alejandro felt lonely. He had sacrificed personal relationships in the name of his career and now faced constant pressure from his investors to maintain the company's growth. The report he was reviewing contained vital data for a meeting the next day, an opportunity that could determine the future of Nova Sol. As he closed his laptop, he couldn't help but feel a slight unease. Something didn't add up. But he couldn't pinpoint what it was. Down in the hallways of the 15th floor, Rosa was making her last round of the night. As she passed near the main conference room, she heard muffled voices. It was strange since the offices were empty at that hour. Intrigued, she cautiously approached and hid behind a decorative plant. If everything goes according to plan, tomorrow first thing in the morning, Alejandro will be out of the game, said a deep voice that Rosa recognized as Mariano Torres, the CFO of the company and Alejandro's right-hand man. And what about the board? Replied another, female and determined voice. Don't worry, with the evidence we've planted, they will have no choice but to expel him. Then we will sell the shares to our partners. Everything is under control. Rosa's heart began to beat faster. She didn't understand all the details, but what she had heard was enough to know that something serious was underway. Betrayal was evident, and Alejandro Gomez was in danger. She knew that keeping quiet would be the safest thing to do. But she also knew she could never forgive herself if she did nothing. She finished her shift with her head full of doubts. As she took off her uniform in the locker room, she decided that she had to warn Alejandro, even if it meant risking her job. It was an impulsive decision, but she saw no other option. The next morning, the lobby of Nova Sol was full of executives, employees, and visitors coming and going. Rosa waited nervously, her gaze fixed on the elevators. Alejandro appeared with his typical confident posture, checking messages on his cell phone while an assistant followed him with a folder full of documents. Rosa, with her heart in her throat, approached him just before he entered the elevator. Mr. Gomez, she said with a firm but restrained voice. He looked up, surprised that someone was calling him directly. Yes, who are you? He asked, briefly glancing at her badge. Rosa Delgado. I work here in cleaning. I need to talk to you. It's important. Alejandro looked confused. Why? Is this a trap? Rosa clenched her fists as if she was fighting herself not to run away. Alejandro stared at her. He could see that she was nervous. But there was something else, determination. The intensity of her gaze made him hesitate, even if only for a moment. Before he could answer, the assistant called out, Mr. Gomez, we're late. Alejandro looked at Rosa one last time and then at the elevator waiting for him. Explain yourself quickly, he said, leaving Rosa with the challenge of convincing him in the few seconds she had before the day took an irrevocable turn. Rosa took a deep breath and looked directly into Alejandro's eyes. She felt like her heart was going to burst. But she couldn't back down now. Every second counted. I overheard a conversation last night. She began in a low but firm voice. People you trust are planning something against you. They said they're going to use false evidence to get you out of the company. Alejandro frowned, incredulous. He was used to dealing with corporate problems. But the idea of a conspiracy in his own company, and one overheard by a cleaner, seemed absurd to him. "Who exactly are you?" he asked, with a tone that mixed doubt and curiosity. Rosa hesitated. She didn't want to mention names there in the middle of the lobby where anyone could hear them. She glanced nervously around and moved a little closer. "I can't say it here," she whispered, "but if you go into that room, you will be surrounded by people who already have everything planned to harm you. I just want to help." Alejandro evaluated the situation. Everything in him told him to ignore this young stranger and continue with his day. But something in her expression, her genuine nervousness mixed with courage, made him hesitate. Besides, he had been feeling uneasy for weeks, as if something in Inova's soul wasn't working as it should. Maybe this girl knew more than she appeared to. "Okay," he said after a tense moment. "Give me 5 minutes. Let's go to my office." Rosa nodded, surprised that Alejandro agreed to listen to her. She followed him to the elevator, ignoring the curious stares of the employees who passed around them. In the elevator, the silence was almost unbearable. Alejandro typed messages on his phone while Rosa wrung her hands, wondering if she had done the right thing. When they reached the 40th floor, Alejandro led her to his spacious office. It was a modern space decorated with minimalist furniture and huge windows that offered a spectacular view of Mexico City. Rosa felt a brief vertigo. It was the first time she had been so high, both literally and figuratively. Alejandro closed the door and crossed his arms, looking at her expectantly. "Now, speak. What exactly did you hear?" Rosa took a deep breath and recounted everything she had heard, the voices of Mariano Torres and an unknown woman, the plan to frame him, and the mention of false evidence. She spoke quickly, trying not to forget any important detail, while Alejandro listened with a grave expression. When she finished, Alejandro remained silent for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Finally, he spoke. "This is serious, but I need more than just words. Miss Delgado, do you have anything else? Any proof?" Rosa shook her head, feeling small under Alejandro's analytical gaze. "I only heard what I said. But I know what I heard. And I know it's true." Alejandro sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't the type of man to make hasty decisions, especially not based on such vague information. But he also knew that ignoring warning signs could be a costly mistake. "Okay," he finally said. "If what you're saying is true, I need to confirm this for myself. I'm not going to cancel the meeting yet, but I'll take precautions. Is there anything else I should know?" Rosa shook her head again. But just as Alejandro got up to open the door, a thought crossed her mind. "One more thing," she said quickly. "I think that woman, the one who was talking to Mariano, she mentioned that someone from the board is also involved." That last phrase seemed to hit Alejandro harder than everything else. The board of directors was the backbone of Innova Sol, composed of trusted people who had worked with him for years. The idea that one of them was plotting against him turned his stomach. "Thank you for telling me," Alejandro said with a more serious tone. Then he looked at her intently. "But this isn't over. If I find out that you lied or that this is a misunderstanding, I will not hesitate to take action." Rosa nodded, knowing that her warning had not fallen on deaf ears. Still, she couldn't help but feel vulnerable. She had risked a lot by approaching him, and she had no guarantee that it would be enough to stop what was coming. As Alejandro escorted her out of the office, his assistant intercepted him. "Mr. Gomez, the meeting is about to begin. The investors are already in the room." Alejandro nodded, but before leaving, he turned to Rosa. "Stay close. If I have more questions, I'll look for you." Rosa nodded once more, feeling her heart pounding as she watched him walk towards the elevator. She couldn't help but wonder if she had done enough or if it was already too late. Rosa returned to the lobby of the building, her legs trembling. She had said everything she knew, but Alejandro's reaction made her uneasy. She wasn't sure if he had really taken her seriously or if, after entering the conference room, everything would remain as an ignored warning. Her mind raced as she sat in a quiet corner, pretending to check her phone so as not to attract the attention of the employees coming and going. Up on the 40th floor, Alejandro entered the conference room with a calm expression, but his mind was in chaos. The international investors were already seated, reviewing papers and giving him expectant glances. Mariano Torres was in the center of the table, smiling as always, the face of absolute confidence. That smile made something in Alejandro churn. He was used to it. But it felt off now. Before we discuss the investment proposal, I want to briefly review our most recent numbers, Alejandro said, as he turned on the projector. Mariano took the floor almost immediately, gently interrupting. Of course, Alejandro, I think it will be useful to share the financial details with our guests. I prepared the reports myself. Alejandro nodded, but his eyes lingered on Mariano a little longer than usual. He decided to let him talk while carefully observing every word and gesture of his supposed ally. Everything seemed normal, but something told him that he shouldn't let his guard down. During the meeting, his thoughts kept returning to Rosa's words. The image of her serious and determined expression didn't leave him. Meanwhile, Rosa continued waiting in the lobby. Uneasy, she knew that Alejandro had more power and resources than she did to investigate what was happening. But she also understood that the traitors in his circle were cunning. For a moment, she thought of going home. What could she do from there? But something made her stay. Maybe it was her instinct or the fear that if she didn't insist, something terrible could happen. After almost 2 hours, Rosa saw Alejandro return to the lobby. His expression was difficult to read. But he didn't look relieved. Instead of passing by, he approached her directly. Come with me, he said without preamble. Rosa followed him to a side hallway where there were fewer people. Alejandro looked to both sides before speaking in a low voice. I've been reviewing the financial data that Mariano presented. Everything looks correct at first glance. But there's something that doesn't add up. Are you sure about what you heard? Rosa felt a knot in her stomach. Although she was sure of what she had heard, the pressure of having to prove it to someone as powerful as Alejandro was overwhelming. Yes, Mr. Gomez. I don't know exactly what they're planning. But what they said was clear. They are going to frame you with false evidence. Alejandro nodded slowly, evaluating the situation. Although he still had no concrete reasons to trust Rosa, something about her inspired credibility. Besides, the warning coincided with the doubts he had been accumulating for weeks. Very well, he finally said. If you're willing, I need you to help me understand what's happening. But you have to know something. This can be dangerous. If they suspect that you know something, they could act against you. Are you sure you want to get involved? Rosa swallowed. She had never been in a situation like this. And the idea of facing people with so much power terrified her. But she thought of her mother, of the sacrifices she made every day, and of her dream of getting ahead. Maybe this was her opportunity to show that she was worth more than everyone assumed. Yes, she replied firmly. I'll do whatever it takes. Alejandro looked at her for a moment, surprised by her determination. Then he nodded. Perfect. First, I need you to remember every detail of that conversation. Every word, every name, everything that can give us a clue. If you have to write it down, do it. I'll take care of investigating on my own. But anything you remember could make a difference. Rosa nodded, feeling how adrenaline began to replace fear. While Alejandro returned to his office, she remained in the vestibule, thinking about everything she had heard and trying to find anything she might have missed. Hours later, Alejandro received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Watch your steps." Attached to the message was a photo taken from the lobby in which he and Rosa were talking that morning. Alejandro felt a chill. This was a warning, a sign that someone was already watching him. He studied the photo attached to the email with a frown. It was sharp and clearly recent. Whoever had taken it was close. Too close. And knew enough to send him a warning. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. If the people responsible were already watching him. He picked up the phone. Rosa, I need you in my office. Now. Rosa, who had remained in the lobby, mentally reviewing what she knew, felt a chill when she received the call. She quickly went up to the 40th floor, this time aware that every step brought her closer to a danger that was only beginning to understand. When she entered the office, Alejandro was standing by the window, holding his phone. He indicated for her to come closer and showed her the photo. Does this tell you anything? He asked in a controlled tone. Although his eyes betrayed concern, Rosa looked at the image and felt her stomach sink. Someone had seen him together, and that meant she was no longer off the radar. Who sent it? She asked, trying to keep her composure. I don't know. It came anonymously. But this confirms something important. They are watching us. This is no longer just a rumor or a supposition. Rosa, it's real. The silence that followed was heavy. Rosa knew that the risk increased with every moment she spent involved. But now there was no turning back. If they had identified her as part of the problem, her only option was to move forward. Last night I heard something else, she finally said, her voice trembling a little but resolute. Mariano mentioned they had a plan B if anyone suspected anything. He said something about diverting money to an account that seemed to be connected to you. Alejandro felt his blood run cold. If what Rosa was saying was true, the damage could be devastating. Not only were they fabricating false evidence, but they were creating a narrative that would leave no doubt about his guilt. Did they mention anything specific? Names, places, anything I could trace? He asked, trying to contain his urgency. Rosa closed her eyes, striving to remember every word of the conversation she had overheard. Finally, something surfaced in her mind. Yes, they said something about San Pedro. I don't know what it means, but Mariano mentioned it as if it were important. Alejandro frowned. San Pedro could refer to many things: a place, a name, a code. It was a clue, though vague. It's a start, he finally said, his tone more determined. I'm going to investigate this. Meanwhile, I need you to be alert. If anything seems out of place, let me know immediately. Rosa nodded, but something in her gaze betrayed a question she didn't dare ask. Alejandro noticed it and looked directly at her. What's wrong? What is it? What if they? Rosa hesitated, but then forced herself to continue. What if they do something to me? If they already know I'm here, they might try to silence me. Alejandro didn't respond immediately. He knew the danger was real, but he couldn't promise her that she would be completely safe. Still, he wasn't willing to leave her alone. I won't let anything happen to you, he finally said, with more conviction than he felt at that moment. But I need you to trust me. This isn't going to be easy, but we'll get through this. Rosa nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in her mind. However, her determination remained intact. She had come too far to back down now. As Rosa went back down to the lobby, Alejandro sat down in front of his computer and began to search for connections related to San Pedro. After an hour of reviewing financial documents, contracts, and old emails, he found something that chilled him to the bone. A recent transfer to an account in a bank located in San Pedro Garza Garcia, an exclusive municipality in Monterrey. The transfer was in the name of an unknown company, but the most disturbing thing was that his signature appeared on the document. Alejandro knew that he had never authorized this transaction. Without wasting any time, he called a trusted contact, a lawyer who had worked with him for years. Julio, I need you to investigate a transfer that appears in my name. It's urgent. I'll send you the details in a few minutes. I need answers as soon as possible. Understood, Alejandro. But be careful. If this is what I think it is, you're in very dangerous territory. Alejandro hung up and leaned back in his chair, feeling the pressure growing with each passing minute. Now he was not only fighting an internal conspiracy, but also a direct attack on his integrity. The feeling of isolation hit him suddenly. But thinking of Rosa, he knew that at least he wasn't completely alone. The next day, while Alejandro waited for answers from his lawyer, Rosa received a strange message on her cell phone. It was from an unknown number and contained only a brief text: "We know who you are. Don't meddle where you're not called." Rosa felt a chill run through her body. The game was becoming more dangerous than she had imagined. Rosa stared at the message on her cell phone, her fingers trembling. Her breathing quickened as her eyes scanned the words over and over again. "We know who you are. Don't meddle where you're not called." It was a clear, direct, and terrifying warning. She pressed the phone to her chest and looked around as if someone might suddenly emerge from the shadows. She knew she had to tell Alejandro, but fear paralyzed her. If they already knew about her involvement, what else could they do to her? Her mind filled with terrible images: someone following her mother, breaking into her small apartment, destroying everything she had. However, she couldn't stay still. She decided to act. She quickly went up to the 40th floor, this time with her heart pounding like never before. She knocked on the door of Alejandro's office harder than she intended. But she didn't care. When he opened it, she found him with the phone in his hand, visibly tense. "Rosa, what's wrong?" he asked. Noticing her pale expression, Look at this, she said, extending the cell phone to him. Alejandro took the device and read the message. His jaw tightened instantly. This confirms that they're watching me. She felt the words hit her harder than she expected. Until that moment, she hadn't fully understood the magnitude of what they were facing. Alejandro seemed used to dealing with pressure and risk. But she wasn't. And now her life was being dragged into something she could barely comprehend. What do we do? She asked, trying to remain calm. Alejandro looked directly at her, his face more determined than ever. First, I'm going to make sure you're protected. No one is going to touch you. Understood? I'm going to call someone to watch over you. Someone I trust. Protect me, Rosa replied, with a mixture of disbelief and fear. And what if they go after my mother? She's alone at home. She can't defend herself. Alejandro understood the gravity of the matter. He took out his phone and dialed a number. Julio, I need another favor. Find private security for someone close to me. A discreet, reliable, but effective service. I'll send you the details in a few minutes. This is urgent. He hung up and turned to Rosa. Your mother will be protected. I'll take care of it. Rosa wanted to believe him, but doubts remained buried in her chest. However, the weight of responsibility left her no choice but to trust him. She was out of her element and she knew it. And you? She finally asked. What will you do? Alejandro took a deep breath and walked to his desk, where he had several papers scattered. He showed her a document he had printed. This, he said, pointing to a bank transfer. I found this transaction linked to an account in San Pedro Garza Garcia. It's in my name, but I never authorized it. It's the proof they need to implicate me. Rosa frowned, trying to understand how they could have forged his signature. It's easier than it seems if you have internal access, Alejandro replied, and his people are using everything they have to cover themselves. But now we know where to look. My lawyer is already investigating the account. Hopefully, we'll find a trace that will expose them before they can continue. A loud noise echoed from the hallway, fast footsteps and an argument on the other side of the door. Alejandro and Rosa looked at each other with concern. A second later, someone knocked hard on the door. Alejandro, open up. It was the voice of Mariano Torres. Alejandro took a deep breath and walked to the door. Before opening it, he looked at Rosa and gestured for her to stay back. When he opened it, Mariano entered with his usual smile. But this time his tone was cold. What's going on here, Alejandro? He asked, his gaze shifting from Alejandro to Rosa and then back to him. You're making very strange decisions, canceling meetings, making unusual calls. The board is worried. Alejandro remained calm, crossing his arms. I'm busy, Mariano. If you need anything, make an appointment. Mariano let out a dry laugh. I'm not here for formalities. We're at a critical moment. And we can't allow distractions. The company needs focus. He paused, looking at Rosa again. No interruptions. The subtext was clear. Mariano knew something. Or at least suspected it. Rosa felt her throat tighten. But Alejandro remained calm. Don't worry, Mariano. Everything is under control. If there's anything else, we'll talk later. Mariano looked at him hard, but finally turned around and left the office. Alejandro closed the door and exhaled. This confirms that they're nervous, he said. They're starting to make mistakes. Rosa looked at him, feeling fear mix with a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could still win this game. But she knew the worst was yet to come. Rosa was sitting in a corner of Alejandro's office, still recovering from the confrontation with Mariano. Her mind was racing, trying to decipher what it all meant, the threats, the false evidence, and the constant danger. For his part, Alejandro was pacing back and forth, holding his phone while waiting for his lawyer Julio's call. They both knew time was running out. Finally, Alejandro's cell phone vibrated. He answered instantly. What do you have for me, Julio? He asked without preamble. The voice on the other end of the line sounded grim. Alejandro, I have bad news. That transfer to the account in San Pedro Garza Garcia is completely legitimized in the bank system. The documents have your signature, and the records show nothing suspicious. Alejandro frowned and rubbed his forehead. Nothing, not even a detail we can question. Not for now, but that doesn't mean it's not a well-crafted forgery. I'm going to check the transaction history of that account. If we find something irregular, we can open a formal investigation. Do it, and let me know as soon as you have anything. Alejandro hung up, letting out a heavy sigh. Rosa looked at him from her corner, unsure if she should say anything. Finally, he broke the silence. It seems they're further ahead than we thought. He murmured, this isn't just a conspiracy, it's a carefully planned attack. Rosa got up and approached him. What can we do? She asked. Alejandro looked at her. His expression hardened. The first thing is to make sure we have some advantage. If they're fabricating evidence, we need to find something that connects them directly. But I can't do it alone. Rosa looked at him, surprised. What do you mean? Alejandro took a paper from his desk and showed it to her. It was a list of names. All of them key employees at Innovasol. These are the people who have direct access to financial information. If there's something Mariano and his allies are doing, one of them knows. I need you to talk to the cleaning and security staff. They see things that others don't. And they might have noticed something. Rosa nodded slowly. Although the idea of getting even more involved scared her, she knew he was right. Her co-workers often talked about what they heard or saw in the hallways. But they never thought those things had any importance. Okay, I'll do it, she said firmly. Thank you, Rosa, and be careful. Don't trust anyone who isn't absolutely necessary. She left the office, trying to control her nerves. She knew she had to be discreet but also efficient. She didn't have much time. Rosa started in the maintenance area where some of her colleagues were cleaning desks and filing cabinets on the lower floors. She approached an older woman, Yolanda, who had worked at Innovasol for over 15 years. Yola, can I ask you something? Rosa said in a casual tone. Of course. What's up? Yolanda replied without stopping her cleaning. Have you noticed anything strange lately? People entering or leaving the offices at odd hours. Or conversations that don't make sense? Yolanda stopped and looked at her curiously. Why do you ask that? It's just curiosity, said Rosa, trying to sound nonchalant. Sometimes it seems like things happen that we aren't told about. You know? Yolanda looked at her a moment longer before speaking. Well, a few days ago, I saw Mariano Torres entering the archive at 11 at night. It's not unusual for him to come late. But what I found strange was that he was carrying a large envelope and seemed very hurried. Also, he wasn't alone. Rosa felt her heart skip a beat. Who was with him? A tall, blonde woman. I think she's from the board. But I don't know her name. She seemed nervous, like she didn't want to be seen. Rosa thanked Yolanda and left quickly. Mariano and a woman from the board entering the archive late at night, that had to mean something. She decided to go to the archive herself. When she arrived at the archive, it was empty. It was a cold, tidy space, full of shelves with folders and boxes labeled with dates and codes. Rosa walked between the aisles looking for anything that stood out. Finally, in a corner, she noticed a box that was slightly out of place, as if someone had moved it recently. She carefully opened it and found a large envelope, just as Yolanda had described. Inside, there were financial documents that she didn't recognize. But what caught her attention was a loose sheet with a diagram connecting several bank accounts with code names. One of them was Gaviota, and it was clearly linked to the San Pedro account. Before she could process what it meant, she heard footsteps approaching. Rosa felt a chill and quickly put the papers in her bag. She hid behind a shelf, holding her breath while the voices came closer. We can't risk it anymore, Mariano, said a cold, authoritative female voice. If Gomez finds anything, we're finished. He won't. I have everything under control, Mariano replied. Rosa closed her eyes, praying that they wouldn't discover her. Her life had just entered a game much bigger than she had imagined. Rosa remained motionless, pressed against the shelf, while listening to the voices of Mariano and the woman. Her heart was beating so hard that she feared the noise would give her away. From her hiding place, she could distinguish enough of the conversation to understand that they were nervous. Don't tell me it's under control, Mariano, the woman said, her tone as cold as steel. Gomez isn't an idiot. And that girl, the cleaning lady, someone told me she was with him this morning. Rosa felt her blood run cold. Now she knew that they had her in their sights as well. Don't worry about her, Mariano responded with forced confidence. We're watching her. If she gets too involved, we can neutralize her. Rosa held her breath. Neutralize, the word echoed in her mind with an unsettling resonance. It was clear that Mariano was not joking. And she was now a target. The footsteps came even closer. And Rosa felt that it was a matter of seconds before she was discovered. She closed her eyes and prayed silently. But just when the footsteps seemed to be about to reach her hiding place, the sound of a phone interrupted the moment. Wait, I have to answer this, said Mariano. Rosa heard the footsteps move away. And soon after, the sound of the door closing. She slowly opened her eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and terror. She took advantage of the moment and quickly left the archive, making sure not to make a sound. Back on the 40th floor, Rosa hurried into Alejandro's office, closing the door behind her. I have it, she said, taking the papers out of her bag. Her voice was full of adrenaline. Alejandro stood up immediately, surprised by her expression. What happened? He asked. Rosa handed him the documents, her hand still trembling. I found this in the archive. Mariano was there a few days ago with a blonde woman from the board. This diagram shows how they're linking accounts, including the one in San Pedro. Something called Gaviota appears connected to that transfer. Alejandro took the papers and quickly reviewed them. His expression changed from surprise to concentration as he studied each detail. This is huge, he murmured. Gaviota is a code name. If we can track these accounts, we can prove they are diverting money and building this entire plot against me. Rosa sat down in one of the chairs in front of the desk, still recovering from the scare. It wasn't easy to get it, she said. Mariano and the woman almost discovered me. I heard they're watching me. They said if I get too involved, they'll neutralize me. Alejandro put the papers on the desk and looked directly at her, his expression serious. This is no longer just a corporate problem. They are willing to do anything to protect themselves. But I won't let anything happen to you. Do you understand? Rosa nodded slowly, though her fear was still there. Tangible. What do we do now? She asked. First, we are going to secure these documents. If they know you have them, they'll go after you, Alejandro replied. Then he paused, as if thinking about the next step. I need to contact Julio to start the legal process. But we also need more evidence. This is just one piece of the puzzle. Rosa looked at him, unsure. How do we get more evidence if they know we're on their trail? I don't think it will be that easy. Alejandro frowned, thinking. Then his face lit up with an idea. The blonde woman from the board. If we can identify her and link her directly to this account, we'll have something more solid. Let me handle that. Rosa nodded, trusting his plan. Although she was terrified, she knew that Alejandro was her best option to get out of this situation. Later that day, Alejandro received a call from Julio. Alejandro, I reviewed the diagram you sent me. It's solid, but we'd need direct access to the accounts to track the movements. Can you get it? Alejandro thought for a moment. He could try to infiltrate the company's servers. But that was risky. If I don't, they'll have the advantage. If we manage to link Gaviota to someone on the board, this changes everything. Let me know when you have something. Alejandro hung up and turned to Rosa, who was still in the office. I'm going to need to get into the company's systems. If I do it right, we could find out who else is involved. But I'll need help to distract them. Rosa nodded, her fear replaced by a growing determination. Tell me what I have to do. Alejandro looked at her with respect. He knew she was risking everything. And that motivated him even more. They both knew that the battle was just beginning. And any mistake could cost them everything. The plan was clear, but the risks were high. Alejandro and Rosa knew they had no margin for error. The only way to obtain enough evidence to expose Mariano and his allies was to access Nova Sol's internal system. Specifically the confidential records of the board and the accounts related to the scheme they had found. Alejandro had a reliable technical team, but he couldn't involve them without raising suspicion. He decided he would have to do it alone. Rosa, for her part, offered to act as a distraction to divert the attention of Mariano and his accomplices while Alejandro worked. This is going to be dangerous, Alejandro said as he adjusted his laptop and reviewed the access he would need. You have to make sure you don't draw too much attention. If something goes wrong, I don't want you to risk yourself more than necessary. Don't worry, Rosa replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I'm already in this. I'm not going to back down now. Alejandro looked at her for a moment, admiring her courage. Despite everything that had happened, Rosa had not broken. She was the reason he kept fighting. Not just for the company, but to do what was right. That same night, Rosa began her shift on the lower floors, making sure her presence seemed routine. At the same time, Alejandro settled into a secondary office on the 20th floor, far from his main office. To avoid being detected, he had gained access to an old terminal that, although slow, was connected directly to the main servers. The first task was to access the protected archive of the board of directors. Alejandro knew that Mariano had administrator privileges, which meant that any unusual movement could alert him. However, he was prepared. He used a copy of the diagram that Rosa had found to justify his entry into the system. Disguising his access, Rosa moved through the halls, carefully observing her surroundings. She had heard rumors that Mariano was working late that night, which made her feel even more nervous. She decided to go to the staff break area, where she knew some cleaning and security employees might be gathered. "Hey, is Mariano still here?" she casually asked one of the guards. A man named Hector, who was always willing to talk. "Yeah, I saw him a while ago on the 30th floor," Hector replied while drinking his coffee. He seemed in a bad mood. It's not unusual for him, but today he's especially unbearable. Rosa thanked him for the information and headed towards the stairs. Although she had no reason to be on that floor, she knew her presence could distract Mariano enough to give Alejandro time. As she climbed, she felt the weight of each step as if the air was getting denser. In the makeshift office, Alejandro was moving quickly. He had found access to the accounts related to Gaviota and discovered something even more alarming: the name of the blonde woman from the board. Her name was Valeria Ruiz, one of the most influential members of the management team and apparently one of the main executors of Mariano's plan. The records showed multiple transfers between accounts that ended in numbers linked to a foreign bank. All of them approved with Valeria's credentials. Alejandro knew that this was the evidence they needed, but he also needed to obtain the complete records to make them irrefutable. Suddenly, he heard a noise outside the office. He tensed, looking towards the door. His hands moved quickly to save the digital documents on a USB device. If they discovered him, everything would be over. On the 30th floor, Rosa arrived at the work area and pretended to be checking the cleaning of the cubicles. A few minutes later, she saw Mariano leaving an office, talking on the phone. His tone was stern, but he didn't seem to have noticed her presence. Rosa pretended to stumble with a cleaning cart, causing several products to fall to the floor with a loud noise. Mariano turned sharply, looking at her with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his gaze like a dagger. "Sorry, Mr. Torres," Rosa replied, trying to sound embarrassed. "They asked me to check this floor because there was a report of incomplete cleaning. I didn't mean to bother you." Mariano frowned, but after a few seconds, he nodded. "Finish quickly and get out of here. I don't need distractions." "Of course, sir, right away," Rosa said, bowing her head slightly before picking up the things and heading toward the stairs. Her heart was pounding, but she knew she had gained a little time. Back in the secondary office, Alejandro finished compiling the data. With the USB in his pocket, he turned off the terminal and left carefully. While he was walking towards the elevator, he received a message on his cell phone. It was from Rosa. "Mariano is on the 30th floor. Be careful." Alejandro pursed his lips, knowing that he had to move quickly. He decided to take the stairs instead of the elevator to avoid a possible encounter. Each step down brought him closer to Rosa and the next move in their plan. When they finally met in the lobby, they both looked at each other with relief. Alejandro took the USB from his pocket and held it up in front of Rosa. "Here's everything. If we manage to expose this, we'll have won." Rosa nodded, but she knew the real battle was just beginning. Now they had the proof. But the enemy would not stand idly by. The clock was still ticking, and every second counted. Rosa and Alejandro were in the office, reviewing the documents on the USB they had just recovered. The information was shocking. Each transfer, each movement of money, and each false authorization pointed directly to Valeria Ruiz and Mariano Torres. Code names like Gaviota hid illegal activities. But with the data now exposed, the plot could unravel. This is enough to start a formal investigation, Alejandro said, his tone full of determination. But we need to make sure they don't have time to react. If Mariano and Valeria discover we have this, they could destroy more evidence or disappear. What will we do then? Asked Rosa, still nervous after having confronted Mariano on the 30th floor. First, I'm going to send this information to Julio. He can prepare a formal complaint with the financial authorities and an injunction to protect us. But I need your help for one last move, said Alejandro, looking at her intently. Rosa nodded, though she couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety. What do you need me to do? Mariano is nervous. We know that. If we confront him directly, he might make a mistake. You're already a target for him, so you can use that to your advantage. You want me to confront him? Rosa asked, surprised. In a way, yes. We need you to make him think you know more than you really do. If he manages to give himself away, we'll have more leverage to act. Rosa swallowed. She knew what Alejandro was asking her to do was risky, but she also knew that if they wanted to get out of this situation, they had no other choice. The next day, Rosa returned to the 30th floor, where she knew Mariano spent most of his time. She made sure to be near the main offices, moving between desks and cleaning areas, pretending to be busy. It wasn't long before Mariano saw her. He approached her with a distrustful look. You again, he said, crossing his arms. What are you doing here now? Rosa looked up, trying to remain calm. She had to appear confident, even though inside she felt like prey in front of a predator. Just doing my job, Mr. Torres, she replied in a firm but respectful tone. Mariano stared at her intently, as if trying to read her mind. Listen, girl, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'm going to give you some advice. Don't meddle in matters you don't understand. It could be dangerous. Rosa took a deep breath. She knew this was the moment to act. Dangerous for me, or for you? She asked, with a slight smile that sought to provoke him. Mariano frowned. What did you say? Nothing. Just that it seems that some movements in this company aren't as clean as they appear. I suppose you wouldn't want that to come to light, would you? Mariano's reaction was immediate. His face tightened, and his eyes showed a mixture of rage and fear. Rosa knew she had struck a nerve. You have no idea who you're playing with, he said, taking a step closer. I suggest you stop talking before you make a mistake you can't fix. Rosa held his gaze. Although her heart was pounding, she decided to deliver the final blow. Maybe I don't know everything, but I know enough, and believe me, I'm not the only one. With that last phrase, she turned around and left the floor before Mariano could respond. Her heart was beating so fast she could barely think. She knew she had just put an even bigger target on her back. But she also knew that she had sown doubts in Mariano's mind. Meanwhile, Alejandro was in his office, reviewing an alternative plan with Julio, the lawyer. With this evidence, we can not only denounce Mariano and Valeria, but also freeze their accounts and prevent them from using more resources to cover themselves. Julio said, but we need direct testimony from someone inside the company. Do you have someone in mind? Alejandro thought for a moment. He knew Rosa was the only one who could do it, but he also knew what it entailed. There is someone, he finally said, but I need to talk to her first. When Rosa returned to the lobby, Alejandro was waiting for her. He took her to a private place and looked at her with a serious expression. You did well. Mariano is nervous. He'll probably try to move quickly to cover his tracks. Rosa nodded, though she could still feel the trembling in her hands. And now what? She asked. Now, we need your testimony, Alejandro said, his tone soft but direct. You've been closer to this than anyone. If you declare what you know, along with the evidence we have, we can stop them. Rosa looked at him, feeling the weight of responsibility fall on her shoulders. She knew what Alejandro was asking her to do was important, but also dangerous. If she testified, she would be putting herself in the sights not only of Mariano, but of everyone who backed him. What if something happens to me? She asked quietly. Alejandro leaned towards her, his eyes showing a mixture of determination and concern. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise you, but we need your help. We can't do this without you. She took a moment to breathe, looking at Alejandro. In that instant, she decided she wasn't going to let fear stop her. Okay, she finally said. I'll do whatever it takes. Alejandro nodded. And at that moment, both of them knew they were closer to the end, but also closer to danger. The battle was far from over, and time continued to run against them. Rosa and Alejandro were ready to launch their attack. With the evidence collected and Rosa's decision to testify, the plan was moving forward quickly. Alejandro contacted Julio to prepare the complaint and coordinate the legal steps. They knew that once it was filed, Mariano and Valeria would have no time to react. However, they also knew that the reaction would be aggressive. Alejandro decided to reinforce security for Rosa and her mother, hiring a small team of trusted individuals to watch over them and ensure their safety at all times. The next morning, while Alejandro was reviewing the last details with Julio, Rosa received a message on her cell phone. It was from an unknown number, but the text was clear and direct. If you go through with this, you will pay the consequences. This is your last warning. Rosa felt fear run through her body, but also a new determination ignite within her. She took a screenshot of the message and sent it to Alejandro. When he saw it, his expression hardened. They're desperate, he said. That means we're doing something right. But it also confirms that they're going to try something before we report them. Julio, who was in the office at that moment, nodded. That's typical. People like them feel untouchable until the very last moment. But if we can move quickly, they won't have time to cover themselves. Alejandro, we need to file the complaint today. Alejandro looked at Rosa, seeking her approval. Are you ready? He asked her. Rosa took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, let's do it. The group went to the Attorney General's office, where Julio filed the formal complaint along with the evidence. Rosa gave her testimony, recounting in detail what she had heard and seen in the Innova Sol offices. Everything was officially registered. Meanwhile, Alejandro made a risky decision. He sent a copy of the evidence to 2 renowned journalists in Mexico City, trusting that the media pressure would protect him from any attempts at retaliation by Mariano and Valeria. If this reaches the media, they won't be able to move without being in the public eye. He explained to Rosa. She nodded, trusting him completely. In the afternoon, while Rosa was returning home under the protection of the security team, Alejandro received an unexpected call from one of his employees. Mr. Gomez, we detected an unauthorized access attempt to your emails and accounts. Someone is trying to hack the system. Alejandro clenched his teeth. He knew this was the work of Mariano and his allies. A desperate attempt to sabotage him before the authorities acted. Block everything and trace the origin. I need to know who's behind this, he ordered. Minutes later, he received another call, this time from the security guard at his building. Mr. Gomez, someone is here asking for you. He says he's a client, but he's not on the appointment list. Alejandro knew it couldn't be a coincidence. Something was underway. Don't let him in and secure the area. I'm on my way. On his way back to the office, Alejandro called Rosa to warn her. Something is happening. They're trying to hack us and probably planning something else. Stay where you are, and don't make any move without me. Understood? Understood, replied Rosa, although she couldn't help but feel a knot in her stomach. Upon arriving at the office, Alejandro met with his security team. The traces of the hack led directly to a computer registered under the name of Valeria Ruiz. That was enough to officially link her to the case. But just when Alejandro thought things were under control, he received an anonymous email. The message contained only one line: your little friend won't be safe for long. Alejandro felt rage ignite within him. He knew this was a desperate attempt to intimidate him, but he also knew he couldn't afford any mistakes. That night, as news of the complaint began to circulate in the media, Mariano and Valeria convened a private meeting at a luxury hotel. Their contacts within the company and in the authorities had warned them that time was running out. We need to get rid of this now, said Valeria, visibly nervous. If Gomez and that girl keep going, we're finished. Relax, replied Mariano, although his voice also betrayed his nervousness. I have a plan, but we need to act before it's too late. Meanwhile, Alejandro met with Rosa in a safe place to plan their next move. This isn't over, he said, his voice firm but calm. They're going to fight to the last moment. But we have something they don't, the truth. Rosa looked at him, scared but determined. We're going to win this. Right? Alejandro nodded. Yes, But we have to be prepared for what's coming. This is going to get worse before it gets better. That night, they both knew that the final confrontation was near. The tension was palpable, but so was the hope that in the end, the truth would prevail. The dawn over Mexico City marked the beginning of a decisive day. The newspapers had already begun to publish the details of the complaint filed against Mariano Torres and Valeria Ruiz. The words, corporate fraud, and conspiracy, at Innova Sol appeared in the headlines, accompanied by excerpts from Rosa's testimony and the evidence presented by Alejandro. The weight of public opinion was beginning to tilt in their favor. However, Alejandro knew that the battle was not over yet. Mariano and Valeria still had powerful allies and resources they could use to protect themselves. To win, they would need more than evidence. They would need a strategic move that would leave them with no options. In the Innova Sol building, Alejandro called an emergency meeting with the board. He knew it was a risky but necessary move to regain control of his company. In the conference room, the gazes of the board members were filled with uncertainty and distrust. I am here to address the accusations that have been circulating, Alejandro began, his voice clear and decisive. But before you judge me, I want to present you with evidence that shows who is behind this conspiracy. He activated the projector, showing the documents that linked the code accounts, the illegal transfers, and the direct connections to Valeria and Mariano. Murmurs began to fill the room as the evidence spoke for itself. This is not just an attack against me, but against this company and all of us who work here, Alejandro continued. I will not allow people like Mariano Torres and Valeria Ruiz to destroy what we have built. Today, I ask you to make a decision, protect the integrity of Innova Sol, or be accomplices to its destruction. The silence in the room was heavy. One of the board members, a woman in her 50s named Clara Mejia, took the floor. This evidence is irrefutable. Alejandro, I'm with you, but we need to make sure that justice is done. Other members began to nod, and the balance began to tilt in favor of Alejandro. Meanwhile, Rosa remained in the safe place where Alejandro had left her. Although she was protected by private security, she couldn't help but feel in danger. Her cell phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. We know where you are. Come out now if you want to save yourself. Rosa showed the message to the head of security, who immediately reinforced the surveillance. But Rosa knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act. She called Alejandro. They've found my location, she said, her voice trembling. I can't stay here. Alejandro responded quickly. I'm coming for you. Don't do anything until I arrive. Soon after, Alejandro arrived at the location with a security team. Rosa was waiting, but her expression was one of concern. I can't keep running, she said. If they find me, they're going to try to silence me forever. Alejandro took her by the shoulders. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. But you're right. We can't hide anymore. You have to come with me to the board. It's time to face this together. Rosa nodded, although fear was still present. She knew that what they were about to do was dangerous. But she also knew there was no other option. In the conference room, Alejandro and Rosa presented themselves together before the board. Alejandro introduced Rosa as a key witness, explaining her courage in exposing the conspiracy. Rosa spoke clearly, recounting everything she had heard and seen, and how Mariano and Valeria had tried to intimidate her. I don't have proof on paper, Rosa concluded, but I know what I heard. And I'm not going to stay silent. The board was impressed by her determination. Meanwhile, Mariano and Valeria, who were present, began to look visibly uncomfortable. This is a lie, said Valeria, rising from her seat. She's nothing more than a cleaning lady. She has no idea what she's talking about. That's enough, Valeria, interrupted Clara Mejia. The evidence is here, and your reaction says it all. We don't need more confirmation. At that moment, the doors of the conference room opened, and two agents from the financial police entered. Mr. Torres, Ms. Ruiz, you are under investigation for fraud and conspiracy. Please come with us. Mariano and Valeria tried to protest, but the agents gave them no option. As they were escorted out of the room, Alejandro and Rosa exchanged a look of relief. They had won. Days later, the news confirmed the arrests of Mariano and Valeria, and Innova Sol's reputation began to recover. Alejandro called Rosa to his office. This time not as an employee but as an equal. Without you, none of this would have been possible. He told her, I want to thank you, not only for your courage, but for reminding me that there are more important things than power or money. Rosa smiled, moved. Thank you for listening to me. Not everyone would have done that. Alejandro handed her an envelope. This is for you, a full scholarship for you to study graphic design. It's time for you to follow your dreams. Rosa took the envelope with tears in her eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Just promise me you'll never stop fighting for what you believe in. Alejandro replied. They both smiled, knowing that although their paths might be different, they would always share the bond of having faced something much bigger than themselves and having emerged victorious. The truth, in the end, had prevailed.